Hello there, welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly politics programme with me, Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up on the show, EU leaders flocked to Brussels this week to discuss all the major challenges of today. Darkening the mood, the European economy in survival mode at almost zero growth, with Germany bracing for a recession and star European companies like Nokia and Volkswagen letting staff go. We ask, how will we get through this very difficult time? And in a major move, the EU has imposed duties on Chinese electric vehicles for 5 years. The thinking is that it will encourage Europeans to buy cars that are made in Europe and not China. In response, the Chinese government has gone after European brandy and luxury cognac. We ask, how will this trade war impact us? And will Brussels' decision end up doing more harm than good? Let's bring in our panel. David Rinaldi, Director of Studies and Policies at FEPS.
Pleasure being with you.
Good to have you. Almut Müller, Director of EU and Global Affairs at the European Policy Centre. And Nicolas Poitier, Research Fellow at the economic think tank Bruegel. Welcome to you all. First, let's just hear why the state of the European economy is causing night sweats here in Brussels.
With low growth and rising global protectionism, the EU economy is in survival mode. Europe's powerhouse Germany is set to shrink for the second time in a row, and France is cutting spending and increasing taxes in what looks like a return to austerity. Meanwhile, US elections are around the corner, and some are warning a Donald Trump win could damage our economy further. With groceries and rents rising from Athens to Madrid, Europeans are feeling the pinch. But governments don't have much spare cash, and belt-tightening via fiscal policy could stifle growth even more over the next few years.
So, David and Nicolas, you both have PhDs in economics, so help us out here. How bad is the situation?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think in the short run, the situation is kind of manageable, but the problem is really the medium term. So we are now at a very kind of we're close to recession in Germany. We might have zero growth in the US as a whole. But we also come out of a very bad cycle where we had first the pandemic, then we had the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and the energy crisis. And then we basically had the ECB having to raise interest rates really strongly to fight inflation. And all of these things suppressed the economy, and the government had to do quite a lot to prevent the economy from tanking.
So bad but manageable in your view. What's your take, David, on the situation? And should we now be saving or should we be spending?
We should do both at the same time. There has been quite a discussion in Brussels on how to revive the possibility of having investment in Europe that is more or less at the level of the one that we can see in the US and China, for instance. So the situation is looming, and I agree, it's not only a fear for the current moment and the recession now, but we are at a moment in which we need to redress our economy, empower our industry, transform it in a way in which it can serve prosperity in Europe for decades to come. So that can hardly be done without investment.
And just on that investment, let's just remind our viewers that a couple of weeks ago we had that Mario Draghi report, of course, calling for 800 billion euros per year, wasn't it? Investment. Alma, you're the political scientist here with us, so break down what the political impact really is of this.
Well, I think it's pretty simple in the end. If Europeans don't feel that they can have a good life and they have fear about their future, then this is something that will inevitably show at the ballot boxes, and we see that already. So it is one of the key missions of the European Union to help create growth and prosperity in a time of transition, as a colleague pointed out here. And so this is a serious situation which the Commission President and the team have understood, placing competitiveness at the very core.
But one thing is understanding the problem, right? The other thing is getting the report from Mario Draghi, the hundreds of pages, because the EU is seriously lagging behind here, as you said. Where will that investment come from, that money?
We need to invest in almost a lot of different sectors, and the analysis of Draghi is good because it looks sector by sector as well, and that is a lot of data there. The political aspect of it is more difficult on how to get it, because if we look at what we have been able to do at the European Union level, the first very big idea and the decisions that the European Union leaders had to take on basically how to respond to the United States Inflation Reduction Act was something that allowed more state aid at national level, which is not really a European response. So we failed to deliver on a European fund for technology and sovereignty fund.
And meanwhile, when it comes to tech, of course, the US are leading. When it comes to manufacturing, the Chinese are leading. Where are we leading?
So we're still very good in many tech sectors, pharmaceuticals, machinery. We're also good when it comes to economic outcomes that are not just money, when it comes to welfare outcomes like health. But we see that our economy is not as dynamic as the American one, and we're really lagging behind in digital products. And I think this is where we really have to invest to get a better market to make our economy more dynamic.
And when it comes to the business sector, they're obviously worried. We see that a lot, that mood around Brussels and beyond. We've seen as well this week the insurance company Allianz Trade putting out new data warning of a severe increase in global business insolvencies, arguing that over 1.6 million jobs in Europe and North America could be at risk next year. For solutions, we checked in with one of the authors of the report in Paris to find out what his message as well was for policymakers. Here's Maxime Lemerle.
Well, there's no magic solution. It's an addition of individual cases. We need to trust. First, CEO of companies, financial directors of companies to do whatever is necessary to keep their business alive, for sure. But the competition is hard, especially in some sectors. And what else can do? Institutions is just to do whatever is necessary to make the environmental and the regulatory context as transparent, efficient as possible without, big changes in the last minute mode that would definitely not help, business owners to anticipate and to do what they have to do to run their business.
That's Maxime Lemerle there from Allianz Trade in Paris, with clear messages for CEOs firstly and also then for policymakers. Quite unsettling time for companies as well.
Well, Interestingly, the Draghi report also talks about the overall picture, talking about things you would not anticipate, security and defense investment, these kinds of things. This is an indication of where we're at as a European continent globally. There's a war waging in Ukraine. There is a situation globally where we feel that our model of going multilateral, relying on strong institutions for dispute settlement is crumbling. There are a lot of questions out there that create a great deal of insecurity. And
for people's daily lives.
Yes.
We will see people losing their jobs. It's already happening.
We have actually in Europe at the moment more than 13 million of unemployed people. It's if you look at the figure, it's like having the entire population of Belgium completely unemployed. Can we accept that we have one entire country that is left unemployed? Plus, even if you look at the people that have a job, at least about 1 out of 10 in Europe, they have a job, but they're still poor.
Well, it's funny because I wanted to actually bring in some good news today so that it's not super gloomy, and actually recall that the employment figures are much better than they were before. And we're actually down at 6% here in the EU. A couple of years ago, obviously, it was really bad. We all remember the Greek debt crisis. So we've seen a drop in the unemployment. Obviously, if you look there at the graph 2020, it was a bumpy time. That's, of course, COVID. So the figures there look a bit better. What should we take away from that, Nicholas? Because, of course, before, these indicators were almost like a barometer for how kind of economic excellence was. But what should we take away from these figures?
So I think the problem in unemployment in the EU is very different than we had when we were in the sovereign debt crisis, where we really had very high unemployment rates in Southern Europe. They have come down, but we still have a really big issue with demographic change and the structural transformation of the economy. Many of the jobs people have now will not exist in 20 years, but also many employees leave the labor force, and employers really searching very hard for skills, and they don't find them often.
I was at a conference recently, and the sister of Mark Zuckerberg was in the room telling everyone, those jobs that you have now, you won't have them in 10 years, they'll be gone. That's another factor we have to think about. AI will be replacing a lot of our jobs.
I think you can feel that in every sector. I think there's some good thinking out there how we can get new jobs. And on the other hand, it's a huge transition also of our societies and the way we're thinking about, how our economies can work, and including the very fundamental question to make sure that at a point when there is a great deal of insecurity and national politicians will first and foremost, react to domestic audiences, understandably, because that's where they're being elected. How is it possible then to keep the union together? This will be very challenging for Commission von der Leyen too.
Could one idea be fixing the single market, getting the single market right, because it's so fragmented now?
I think this will be one of the mantra of the current condition, deepening the internal market. It's in the Letta report, in the Draghi report. I think it's also very much in several of the mission letters. The how is the problem.
How is the problem? I mean, this is something your Bruegel, the think tank you work for since 2019, is working on constantly. What are your solutions?
So the first thing we really have to get straight is actually our capital market. Letta called it the Saving and Investment Union. Right now, companies primarily finance themselves through banks, and that is to some extent inefficient. It also doesn't allow the kind of venture capital we see in the US that creates all these kind of startups. So this is should be the first priority, really getting the capital markets right. We see some progress on that, but we still see some resistance, especially from smaller member states that won't protect their own advantage of having a low regulated market.
And we don't have any unicorns, really, hardly any of these unicorns. So startups with an excess of 1 billion.
The lack of financing and the lack of a real single market is making that difficult for Europe. But what we see actually is that the smart and advanced businesses, they are relatively in favor of European regulation, because they see that is not hampering the development, but is actually providing a common framework where they can do investment in a way in which they know that it might have a return over time. So the opposite of not having European regulating, for instance, on artificial intelligence that we have mentioned, is that we have 27 different regulations with countries moving in different ways. That is something that definitely is not going to help the European economy.
No, and it means if you're a young entrepreneur with a brilliant idea, you're going to head to the United States, where as well there's a culture of it's okay to fail. We don't have this culture, Ahmed, here in the EU. It's not cool to try a business idea and then to fail. We just don't have that confidence.
Well, I think I work in the business of creating good ideas, and I have to accept that every day there will be failure on this one. But you're completely right on an honest note. Of course, we need to be bold. This is a time for being bold because this world out there has gotten quite cold. And this is for the first time that we see the union has to be able to form at a time of real global uncertainty, of vulnerability, of war. And, we have to be able to protect our people during bad times as we were during good times. And this is a real test.
And to be bold, we need the vision. We need the leaders. Go on.
Yeah, and if I may add on that, if you're a US startup, you have immediately access to 300 million customers. In Europe, the biggest market is Germany, maybe 80 million customers. But basically every single market, especially in digital services, is regulated at a national level. And that means a lot of complexity for you as a business that makes it close to impossible to scale and compete with US businesses.
And we always talk about this single market and the over 400,000 people, but is it really a single market or is it just an abstract illusion, something that we're trying to get to?
No, there is a single market, and it's a big treasure of this union. And I think it's very difficult for the European citizens to see the value of it in their daily life. But actually, it is something that should deliver better prices, better services, and possibilities for businesses. I think small and medium enterprises, they start now, after many years, to take the benefits of a real common market, and there's much more, and there's still much more to do that. But there is still, to me, one point that is, of course, we have to improve on on pushing for startup. But the model is still very much US. It's not something that we will ever achieve, parity on this ability, because also the capitalization that they can have there, we will never be able to provide that one.
Even though Emmanuel Macron has been trying, hasn't he, in France? This has been a big thing for him, trying to create a little tech hub in France.
But that is good, and we should multiply this. I think in Portugal that has been something done fantastic. I think Berlin and a few other cities. Estonia is one of our of the countries that is leading on everything digital, including a lot of big tech corporations. But at the same time, I would like to see our model, the European model, very much somehow based on different principles rather than you have to win big only. That is one way in which you can do the economy, but there are many other ways in which still you can rely on small and medium enterprises. You can rely on partly state-owned companies, which in the US are almost no go, but here they generate technology, innovation, and employment. So it's good to push on something that we are missing, but is also recognizing the strength of the model.
So I agree with that. We need to somehow protect our social model. I think that is core to identity, is core what we want, and we see really good outcomes for that when we compare also to the United States in terms of health and well-being. But at the same time, I think there's a trade-off between protecting old industries and promoting new ones. And I'm really worried that right now the trend is to protect incumbent industries and not invest into the future. And the US has done that very well in a way that we haven't.
Quick reaction to that?
Well, I think it really goes down to fundamental differences over, what should we be doing in this day and age. The single market, the way it was set up for a different world. And, what the union has tried to develop over the past years was also more teeth and trying to fence off. And, so the question is how much more of that, how much more of protecting we need, and, to what extent there is a trade-off then with regard to the openness that we need as a single market as well that wants to have still a global outreach. So this is battles that need to be fought at political level. They're ongoing and they're going to get fierce, I believe.
And watching them very closely is, of course, the millennial generation and Gen Z, very worried amidst all this talk of a very stagnant EU. For their take, I caught up with Andrea Gerosa. He's the founder of Think Young. Take a listen.
Obviously, you have inflation pressing high. That has a pressure on, wages, salary, purchasing power, but also, the possibility to afford housing, which is a big problem now for young people. And the second one, which is growing more and more, and we do a lot of research, we see it a lot, it's mental health. That is a huge issue for young people, especially in Europe, and it's growing. Growth means, reduce all the red tape, the single market, many messages we know, but should be pushed a lot because things are accelerating in the rest of the world. And then Europe is lagging behind. So if we look at the next 10 years, we need really to step up.
So Andrea Gerosa there speaking to me from Geneva, packing in as well a lot of points, but also stressing this anxiety and mental health crisis as well among youth today. This is also very concerning.
The European Union actually has already launched a mental health strategy. We have somehow an ongoing discussion on the European Health Union that kicked off after, of course, the COVID pandemic. It's still a struggle to find the EU competences or the way in which you can deliver. But it is rather clear that is a priority for the Union. Well,
especially when we think about how we can become more productive. How can we have better output when you're dealing as well with such a serious mental health crisis?
We see that in member states. The numbers are very clear about that, and they give reason for concern. But I want to come back to the competence question. And I know, the treaties are the treaties, and the competencies are the competencies. But I think this Commission will have to be engaging a lot more politically because expectations are so high. And I think whatever it takes in negotiations between member states and the EU level in performing in these areas, we would need that. Often you have sort of discussions over treaties and what is possible and what's not. This is not the time to do that. There is real urgency, and you give an example of how we make sure that our people in Europe have the ability to live lives where they can have productive lives and happy lives. This is no small thing. We can't look at you didn't mean it, but competencies are not at the core of the issue here.
And also give hope to people, especially young people in countries like Spain and Greece. If you look at the graphs, they're still very high up when it comes to unemployment rates. A lot of people still living with their parents, even though they're right into their 30s. That's, of course, a big issue that will have to be addressed. I think housing is also something we've heard that could be sort of addressed, even though, of course, it's not up to Ursula von der Leyen to fix.
It's not to Ursula, but we will have a dedicated commissioner. And actually, if we go out 1 second out from the economics and we go the political aspect here, it is true that we'll have several commissioners in charge of, I would say, economic-related portfolio, from competitiveness and transition and investment. we are partly compromising the part on jobs and employment. At the moment, there's not a specific competence. There is in the mission letter, but a little less in the naming of the title of the commissioner. But we will have a commissioner for intergenerational fairness and youth. So that is at least one we expect.
So on paper, things look interesting. Let's see how they actually develop. One other thing, obviously, we're keeping an eye on here is the US elections taking place in just over 2.5 weeks. There's, of course, a feeling of nervousness everywhere, and even as well on the financial markets. And we saw the president of the German Bundesbank, Joachim Nagel. He's already said how he feels, that he reckons Trump's victory could be accompanied by drastic increases in tariffs and expansionary fiscal policy, leading to noticeable losses in growth in the euro area and Germany. Nicholas?
Yeah, I think this is really the big unknown for the year. I think there were at the beginning of the year, there were two things that could have changed the trajectory. And I think one was the Chinese economy, which is not looking great. So that is something that really changes EU in external trade. But the other one is really, does Trump win? And then if he wins, he has been very clear that he wants to impose a lot of tariffs. He said this week he said that tariff is his favorite word in the dictionary. He says every second word in his speeches are nowadays tariffs.
And deregulation.
Yeah.
And cutting taxes. So obviously it's good for American business, but not for us here.
The debate over what's happening in the US for a long time has been more looking over the pond rather than focusing on what we need to do here at home. And regardless who makes the race, I think it's very important to strengthen the European Union and Europe, because we need to learn, no least because of a war of aggression on our doorstep, to continue standing up for our own prosperity and security, and beef up on that and become better. And of course it matters who sits in the White House. I'm not playing that down at all, but I think the work really seriously needs to start at home, because we can no longer rely on others so engaging on European affairs. These times are gone.
And of course the times as well are gone of just relying on Germany, because of course we look at the instability there. But on that point, we can conclude this conversation. Thank you so much to our panel for your analysis and for sharing your views. Stay with us though here on Euronews, because after the break we'll be telling you why the EU and China are having it out in the boxing ring. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this week on the show we're taking a little look at the reasons why the European economy is in decline. But we also want to zoom in onto the EU-China trade war that's been brewing on the sidelines. In case you missed it, back on the 4th of October, the EU announced it would slap duties on Chinese electric vehicles for 5 years. In response, Beijing said it would introduce provisional measures against imports of European brandy. So, Nicholas, I'm turning to you first, because here we are in what looks like a trade war. It looks pretty nasty. Was this the right move of the EU?
I think it was the right move. It is very controversial also among economists, because they are real costs, not just in terms of a trade war, but more importantly in terms of the green transition. We want cheap EVs. But on the other hand, we cannot longer turn on the other cheek to Chinese industrial policy. And we are in a moment where, to deal with this domestic economic malaise, the Chinese government is doubling down on industrial policy. So here the Commission really chose to kind of set a foot down, even against the member states.
And when you say we want cheap EVs, we've been getting them from China, with China being the biggest importer of EVs for the last couple of years. And also this week we saw the Paris Motor Show take place, which naturally was full of Chinese car manufacturers. David, have you been following this at all? And what's your take?
My take is that the Union has moved, but we have moved in a much kinder way than the US or Canada, for instance. They have imposed a 100% tariff on electric vehicles. So basically our declaration is not a declaration of war, but it's a declaration of half friendship. So compared to the global trade, we are still a great partner for China, and particularly not only on the tariff that is there, and Chinese government, of course, they didn't want it. But at the same time, we are very participatory in the way we include Chinese authorities in the discussion. So there is an ongoing talk that I think it will prevent a real big war.
Okay, and of course you said the Chinese government were not happy. That's why they went after the French, because they feel that the French were one of the countries that was most supportive of the move. Of course, this is all as well, Almut, taking place in a context of geopolitical tensions.
Well, I think we already had the right direction of this debate, saying, well, on the other hand, we have, as Europeans, to show that our single market has teeth, that we have our own interests, and that we are also willing to pursue our interest, even though that might be controversial amongst member states, because we need to be taken seriously in this world, the single market we are. But this message also came with a message of willingness to negotiate. And this is very important as well, because both China and the EU share significant interests in each other in this field. And the global environment, a colleague pointed out to the United States, to North America at large, Europeans are in a different position here. We have different interests, and so it will be important to navigate that as well. It's not an easy thing to do in the years to come. I believe we will see more controversy in this area, but Europeans need to stay calm and cool-headed in order to be able to navigate that, pull their weight, but also show willingness to negotiate.
Cool heads. I think that's also what some of the countries who didn't opt in favour of this move want, like the German Minister for the Economy, Robert Habeck. He spoke to the press and expressed his concern. Take a listen.
Meine Position kennen Sie. Ich halte die nachgewiesene Position von Europa für glaubwürdig.
I think Europe's proven position is credible. I believe there is indeed evidence that China is artificially ramping up capacity with subsidies in order to take them over aggressively.
Aggressiv zu übernehmen. Gleichwohl bin ich kein Fan von.
Nevertheless, I am not a fan of tariffs, of countervailing duties, because this will probably lead to countermeasures and perhaps involve us in a tariff dispute with China. So I urge a political solution.
Eine politische Lösung.
That was Robert Habeck there, so also looking for some sort of cool heads and a political solution.
So I'm not sure what the political solution would look like. It's going to be really difficult for China to make concessions here. So I think the big question is Europe willing to pay the price, and the majority of the EU institutions thought it's worth the price. And it's also the question of basically how do you want to interact with China in the future. Right now the retaliation is very symbolic. And of course farmers matter quite a lot politically, but economically brandy is not the most important export of the EU, or cognac, which is affected here. So I think the economic effect will be rather limited. And in the end of the day, to avoid any conflict in the interest of the European economy because of fear of retaliation also sends a very difficult signal.
I wanted to mention that, cognac is good to mention the brandy industry, but also the dairy at the moment is quite impacted. Dairy is quite impacted, and particularly in France and Spain. My feeling is that we might have targeted the retaliation here and there because the Chinese, they have to show that there is somehow a response, but it's not in the interest of China as well to enter into a trade war. So my feeling is that they will respond but not engage into a war. And we live in these fascinating times in which basically you see the US, the champion of neoliberalism, that is actually putting up, closing on trade and putting up some protectionistic measures. China, that is instead, the communist bloc that is instead for free trade and openness. And Europe in the middle, we have this way in which we started with open strategic autonomy, now economic security.
Europe in the middle trying to find itself. But David, you mentioned there dairy. That's one way that consumers could eventually be impacted, and we wanted to hear how else consumers could be impacted. So we had a quick chat with Augustin Genia, the Director General of BEUC. Take a listen.
We need to create incentives for car makers to make smaller cars, which are more efficient and cheaper for consumers. We also need to have a second-hand market of electric vehicles, which today it doesn't exist. And that requires other type of interventions that are very much needed in order to develop this market and make it more accessible to consumers. The tariff applied to electric vehicles coming from China are just one component to protect competition in the internal market. But certainly much more needs to be done if you want to make cars more accessible to all consumers.
Augustin Reina there, the Director of the European Consumer Organisation. And Almed, also last week we saw in the European Parliament a 3 or 4 hour debate about this topic as well, but turning as well on the fact that as of 2035 we'll be rolling out the sale of the combustion engine. So big change ahead.
Big change ahead, and we see already in the run-up to the European Parliament elections, of course, there was a lot of polarization. Some parties also wishing to polarize on this and creating fear. This is, I think, something that Ursula von der Leyen also reflected in the tone that she chose when she talked about the future of, everything that was branded the Green Deal in the past. But I fundamentally believe that really there is no choice, because the future is in a transition, and it is politically important to create confidence and trust in this process. And we've seen too much polarization. This doesn't help at all.
And on that point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our panel for being with us and for your inputs. And thank you so much for watching. Take care and see you soon. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with David Rinaldi, Almut Müller and Nicolas Potier, we're just talking through the stories making the news lately. And one that we wanted to hone in on was the G20 calls for a tax on billionaires across the world. The French economist Gabriel Zucman says a 2% minimum tax on this wealth would raise up to $250 per year. And the new conservative French government is also trying to tax the wealthy, the German Social Democrats too. So let's get the view of our panel on this, because the conversation has finally gone mainstream, but has the needle really moved?
The feeling is that there's more and more interest on this, and there's more and more openness from different governments, particularly led from the government of Brazil that was chairing G20. And as Europeans, we also have our push. It's a moment in which we have been discussing on it. We need investment to renew our industry, to lead the transition. And of course, this idea of a wealth tax, it sounds very radical, but at the end, we had wealth tax up to a few years ago in many European countries. Norway is there, and Switzerland is there, and Spain is there. It's not necessarily detrimental to the economy. It's a little part of the top 1% of the richest that is affected.
Indeed, we're talking about the 3,000 most wealthiest people in the world that would be impacted here, because currently, according to the G20 statement, they're only paying about 0.3% of tax. So could this really be a game changer?
I think maybe not in fiscal terms, because 250 billion for the world is not a lot.
Yeah.
But it really matters for other reasons. So we see how billionaires in some countries have too much influence. We see this in the United States, where Elon Musk just buy Twitter and just change it to like a right-wing platform overnight. But we also saw the influence that oligarchs can have in our own countries, where they use European countries to launder their money and to make their income, their legal incomes that they get from stealing from their own citizens, legal in the EU. And we saw this really kind of what happened with the Russian oligarchs that used EU countries for this, and that also kind of then gained a lot of influence in the EU and made our reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine very difficult.
And you mentioned Elon Musk. I was reading this week that he could become one of the world's first trillionaires. So there you go, along with Mark Zuckerberg. What's your take on all this, Ahmed?
It's an important debate for the reasons that Niklas described here. What I do think, though, is that the issue is much bigger. We need a new understanding in EU countries. If we want the state to help be in charge of doing good things for our citizens, if we want the EU level to be able to do that, we need to have the means. There is no such thing as just taking everything for granted. And this is the bigger discussion I think we need. And here, because you were asking about the needle is shifting. Because there was a time in which there was the assumption that, in a kind of ultra-mercantile way, things will be falling into place, but they haven't. And so this will raise a lot of questions, discussions, headlines. I can just imagine what will be in the papers, when we start moves in this direction. But the debate that we need on these questions actually is a bigger one. And this could also be a starting point for it.
And we saw last week in the European Parliament in Strasbourg a very fiery debate over this topic. And it was quite interesting to see the far left and the far right were very much on the same page. Take a look.
La bataille The cultural battle we've been fighting for years is finally starting to bear fruit. Even the G20 now wants to tax billionaires. So what are we waiting for, dear colleagues? Do we want it to take not 10 million years, but 20 million years of minimum wage to reach Bernard Arnault's wealth?
We
are on track to impose more substantial taxes on these great fortunes. However, it is crucial that each state retains controls over the tax revenues it receives. This approach must not become a pretext for interference in the competences of member states.
une ingérence dans les compétences des États membres.
That's Manon Aubry and Pierre Pimpy. They're two French MEPs expressing their joy that this could one day become a reality, but of course won't be up to the Parliament.
Yeah, the problem really in the EU it's a global problem, because we see tax avoidance globally and billionaires can use this very effectively. But we have tax havens in the EU. These are member states like Ireland, like Luxembourg, but also the Netherlands that fight fiercely against any interference in their low tax regimes, that not just impose low taxes on corporations in their own countries, but also they allow companies from other countries to avoid taxes in these countries. And so there, I think really there's a strong interest. You can only tax this if you do it globally, if you do it in cooperation, because otherwise it will be avoided. At the same time, some countries completely block any progress.
And of course, a lot of wealthy are stashing their money as well in tax havens, Cayman Islands.
We have to go there and avoid somehow that the tax evasion is so prominent. I think some estimation point out that there is about €2,000 per European citizen missing out of tax avoidance. But one of the big differences in the debate, it seems that they agree, but there's a big difference between the left and the right in the idea of how much Europe you should have into a potential new wealth tax. So we don't have the tax yet, but we are already fighting on how to spend it in a sense. And the feeling is that it would really be important, if not all the revenues, but at least part of the revenues, they go to create a real European own resource so that we have some common financial
Well, of course,
power.
politically, this is a huge topic for the French left. We could even see there Manon Aubry wearing that T-shirt there. It went very viral, this move on social media. And also, though, we're seeing now the French government, the conservative French government, going after wealthy families, I think of over €250,000 earnings a year. They're trying to tax them and companies as well.
Well, we see that, as you mentioned earlier on, that the Social Democrats, the party of the German Chancellor, has just put forward a manifesto wanting to work on not the super rich, but the upper segment, which already creates a lot of controversy in the country and political push from conservative side. But it also shows this is something that people care about deeply, because it goes to the question of fairness, to the question of respect for work that you do. And I think it's important to have that debate and to trigger it again for our societies to be able to sustain an idea that there's a place for everyone here in Europe to live of the work that you do, and you have to just address where violations are happening, absolutely, but there needs to be probably a recalibration of things as well.
And on that point, we can conclude this very interesting conversation. Thank you so much to David Rinaldi for joining us, also to Amit Muller and Nicolas Potier. Thank you so much for being our guest this weekend. And thank you so much for watching. If you would like to reach out with any comments, please do. BrusselsMyLove@Euronews.com is our email address. We're also on social media. You can DM us there and we will get back to you. Take care and see you soon here on Euronews.